The security camera notification lit up David Chen's phone at 7:23 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. Again. A silver Mercedes SUV, the same one he'd seen parked in his driveway for the third time that week, sat blocking his garage entrance. David, a 42-year-old civil engineer who'd spent 15 years designing municipal infrastructure, stood at his kitchen window holding his coffee mug so tightly his knuckles went white. For 6 weeks, his neighbor Linda Westbrook had been treating his private driveway like her personal overflow parking. 6 weeks of polite notes left on windshields ignored. 6 weeks of knocking on her door to ask her to move, met with dismissive eye rolls. 6 weeks of being late to work, missing appointments, and feeling like a stranger on his own property. But this morning was different. This morning, David wasn't just frustrated, he was finished playing nice. What Linda didn't know was that the civil engineer she'd been dismissing had spent the last 2 weeks pulling property surveys, reviewing easement laws, and making very specific phone calls. And today, everything was about to change. Before we dive into how David permanently solved his parking problem, if you love stories where entitled neighbors finally learn that property rights aren't suggestions, hit that like button and subscribe. Trust me, you'll want to see how this plays out. Now, let's see exactly how one engineer turned the tables on 6 weeks of entitled parking violations. This is a story in 3 parts. The violation that pushed a reasonable man past his breaking point, the confrontation where legal knowledge became the ultimate weapon, and the resolution where concrete and steel delivered the final word. In the first part, you'll see how what started as occasional inconvenience escalated into brazen daily violations. How a hard-working professional who'd done everything right, owned his home outright, maintained his property immaculately, followed every rule, found himself prisoner in his own driveway. How polite requests turned to desperate pleas, and how those pleas were met with shocking entitlement and dismissal. You'll feel his frustration build as the system he'd relied on completely failed him. In the second part, the power dynamic shifts completely when David stops asking and starts demonstrating exactly what happens when you antagonize someone who builds things for a living. Property lines, legal precedents, and municipal codes become weapons more powerful than any argument. And in the final part, justice arrives not with a gavel, but with a construction crew, teaching one entitled neighbor that some lessons are built to last. Here's exactly how it happened. David Chen had purchased the modest 3-bedroom ranch house in suburban Portland 5 years earlier, paying cash after saving diligently through his 30s. The property's crown jewel was its extra-wide driveway, a full 30 feet across, enough for 3 vehicles side by side that he'd specifically chosen because his work truck, personal car, and weekend project motorcycle all needed space. As a senior civil engineer for the county's Public Works Department, David's reputation was built on precision, documentation, and following regulations to the letter. His neighbors had always considered him quiet, helpful, and impossibly organized. He was the guy who brought his elderly neighbors' trash cans in every Thursday, who'd helped 3 different families navigate permit applications, who kept his lawn immaculate and his property values high. He worked 50-hour weeks designing the very roads people drove on, often bringing project files home to review late into the evening. The last thing David Chen was looking for was conflict. The problems began on a mild September morning when David left for work and found an unfamiliar silver Mercedes GLE parked diagonally across his driveway, blocking his garage. Linda Westbrook, who'd moved into the house next door 3 months earlier, emerged as David stood there checking his watch. She was a real estate agent in her late 40s who drove the Mercedes as a status symbol and treated every interaction like a negotiation she'd already won. David smiled politely and explained that she was blocking his driveway and he needed to leave for work. Linda barely glanced up from her phone. "Oh, I'll just be a minute," she said dismissively, not moving. I'm waiting for a client call. David, raised to be accommodating, waited. 15 minutes later, after he'd missed his morning project meeting, Linda finally sauntered out, climbed into her Mercedes without apology, and drove away. David assumed it was a one-time misunderstanding. He was wrong. 2 weeks later, it happened again. David came out at 6:45 a.m. to find the Mercedes blocking his garage, this time parked even more aggressively, actually on his property rather than just blocking the apron. When he knocked on Linda's door, she answered in a bathrobe, annoyed at being disturbed. "Your driveway?" she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "This whole area is basically shared parking. You don't own the street." David, stunned, explained that this was his private driveway, on his property, clearly defined by the property line. Linda rolled her eyes. "God, you're uptight." "It's just parking. I have clients coming and going all day. My driveway fills up." "You're being ridiculous." She shut the door in his face. David stood there, his engineering mind struggling to process the sheer audacity. He'd dealt with difficult contractors, stubborn city councils, and impossible project specifications. But he'd never encountered someone who simply refused to acknowledge basic property ownership. The third incident broke something in David's carefully maintained patience. He returned home from a grueling 12-hour day managing an emergency bridge inspection to find not just Linda's Mercedes, but also a BMW he didn't recognize, both parked in his driveway. He couldn't access his own garage, couldn't park his work truck with its expensive surveying equipment. His motorcycle sat exposed to the threatening rain clouds because his garage was inaccessible. When David knocked on Linda's door this time, she answered with two well-dressed clients standing behind her. "Seriously?" she hissed. "I'm showing a property. This is so unprofessional of you." David felt his face flush. "You're parked in my driveway. Both of you. I can't get to my garage." Linda turned to her clients with an exaggerated sigh. "See what I mean about this neighborhood? Some people have no sense of community." She turned back to David. "We'll move when we're done. Go away." The door shut again. David stood there in the darkening evening, rain beginning to fall on his expensive equipment, and something crystallized in his mind. This wasn't going to stop. She wasn't going to change. And waiting for her to become reasonable was like waiting for concrete to turn to water. David tried the proper channels first, naturally. He called the non-emergency police line, explained the situation, and was told that unless the vehicle was blocking the public street, it was a civil matter. "Have you tried talking to your neighbor?" the dispatcher asked wearily. David almost laughed. He left a formal written notice on Linda's windshield the next time she parked there, citing the specific property line and requesting she cease immediately. Linda left the note on his doorstep, torn in half. When David caught her in person the following Saturday and tried to explain calmly that this was trespassing, she actually laughed in his face. "You're going to sue me over parking? Do you know how pathetic that sounds? Get a life, David. Not everyone is as anal as you." Her dismissiveness stung worse than outright hostility. But David Chen hadn't spent 15 years designing public infrastructure without learning something crucial. Every system has rules, and rules, properly understood and applied, were more powerful than any amount of bluster. If Linda Westbrook thought this was about parking, she'd completely misunderstood who she was dealing with. David stopped knocking on her door. Instead, he pulled his property survey from his files, confirmed his exact property lines, and began making phone calls. He contacted the county planning department where he'd worked for over a decade and had friends in every office. He reviewed municipal codes regarding fence permits, setback requirements, and right-of-way easements. He spent 2 evenings after work walking his property line with his professional surveying equipment, documenting every inch. And then he made one very specific call to a contractor he'd worked with on 3 major county projects, a man who owed him several favors and happened to run the fastest fence installation crew in Portland. By the end of week 5, David had permits filed, materials ordered, and a construction date scheduled. If they wanted to play games, David would show them what games really looked like when an engineer was playing. And on Friday morning, October 18th, everything was finally ready. The trap didn't require any elaborate timing. Linda's entitled behavior was predictable as sunrise. At 7:15 a.m. on that Friday, David's security camera caught her Mercedes pulling into his driveway again, this time with a coffee cup visible in her hand, completely casual about her trespass. But this time David was ready. He'd parked his work truck across the driveway entrance behind her the night before, effectively boxing her in. When Linda finished her coffee and strutted toward her Mercedes 15 minutes later, she found David standing beside his truck, arms crossed with his phone recording. "Going somewhere?" David asked calmly. Linda's face flushed. "Move your truck, now. I have a showing in 20 minutes. David's smile didn't reach his eyes. "No, Linda, I don't think so. See? We're going to have a conversation and you're going to listen for once." Linda's hand moved toward her phone. "I'm calling the police. You're holding me hostage." David's calm never wavered. "Please do. I'd love to explain to them how you've been trespassing on my property for 6 weeks, despite repeated requests to stop. I have it all documented." Something in his tone made Linda pause, her certainty flickering for the first time. David pulled out his tablet and began displaying what 6 weeks of careful documentation looked like when compiled by someone who documented infrastructure projects for a living. "Let's talk about what I know, Linda. Linda Marie Westbrook, age 47, real estate license number 2018-47592, with Prestige Properties Northwest. You live at 2847 Maple Ridge Drive with your husband, Robert Westbrook, who's a pharmaceutical sales rep currently traveling in California, and your daughter, Jennifer, who's a sophomore at Lincoln High School. Your Mercedes is registered in your business name, which means every time you park it on my property without permission, it's not just trespassing, it's commercial use of residential property, which violates your homeowner's insurance and potentially your business liability coverage." Linda's face went pale. "How do you—" David continued, his engineer's precision cutting through her protest. "I know because I've spent 15 years working with every department in this county. Property records, business licenses, vehicle registrations, it's all public information when you know where to look. Your real estate license requires you to maintain professional standards. Repeated trespassing violations might be something the state licensing board would find interesting, especially documented violations with timestamps and video evidence." Linda's bravado crumbled like poorly mixed concrete. "You're insane." "This is harassment." David shook his head slowly. "No, Linda, harassment is parking on someone's property for 6 weeks despite being asked repeatedly to stop. Harassment is dismissing someone's rights because you don't feel like walking an extra 30 feet. Documentation is just good engineering. So here's how this works now." David's voice dropped to something harder than rebar. "You have 2 choices. Choice 1. I file a formal trespassing complaint with the sheriff's office using 6 weeks of documented evidence. I submit a complaint to your licensing board detailing how you've used your business vehicle to repeatedly violate property rights. I file a civil suit for property damage, lost work time, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. And before you laugh, I've documented being late to 3 county meetings and 1 emergency response because your car blocked my garage. My attorney, who happens to handle county contract disputes, estimates about $15,000 in damages when you factor in my hourly rate and documented costs. That's choice 1. Linda's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. Her neighbor's 2 teenage children had appeared on their porch, watching with obvious interest. David continued, pulling out a document folder. Choice 2. You sign this. It's a formal agreement acknowledging you've been parking on my property without permission. You agree to never park on my property again. You pay me $2,000 in compensation for the documented instances of trespassing and work disruption. That's 27 separate incidents at roughly $75 each, which is extremely generous considering my actual hourly rate. And you make a formal written apology. He handed her the printed agreement. You have until 5 p.m. today to decide. After that, I file everything with the county on Monday morning. Linda stared at the document, her hands shaking. This is blackmail. David's expression never changed. No, Linda, this is consequences. Something you apparently never learned about. He pulled out his phone. I have your husband's cell number, by the way. The one listed on your property deed. Would you like me to call him and explain what's been happening? Or would you prefer to handle this like an adult? The fight drained out of Linda Westbrook like water from a broken pipe. She looked at the agreement, at David's unwavering expression, at the security camera mounted on his garage that had documented everything. I'll sign it, she whispered. But not 2,000. That's insane. David pulled out a calculator. 27 incidents. My consulting rate when I work private projects is $225 per hour. Each incident cost me an average of 30 minutes. That's $3,375 in lost time alone, not counting stress, inconvenience, or property wear. $2,000 is me being extremely generous. But if you'd prefer, I can use the full calculation in court. Linda's eyes filled with tears of frustration and humiliation. Fine, I'll pay it. Just let me go. David handed her a pen. Sign here, and initial here. You'll have a copy. I'll have a copy. My attorney will have a copy. As Linda signed with shaking hands, David delivered his final terms. And Linda? If I ever see your vehicle on my property again, even one tire over the line, I won't call or write a note. I'll have it towed immediately and file criminal trespassing charges. Do we understand each other? Linda nodded, clutching her copy of the agreement like it burned her hands. David moved his truck. Linda practically fled to her Mercedes. As she backed out, David called out one last thing. Oh, and Linda? Check your mailbox next week. You'll want to see what's being built. Linda's confused expression was the last thing David saw before she drove away. He smiled for the first time in weeks. Phase 1 was complete. Phase 2 was going to be even more satisfying. Linda delivered a cashier's check for $2,000 to David's mailbox on Monday morning, left without a word. David deposited it without comment and made a single phone call. On Wednesday at 7 a.m., a commercial construction truck pulled up to David's property with 5 workers and a truck loaded with materials. Linda emerged from her house in her bathrobe, coffee in hand, and froze. David stood in his driveway, arms crossed, watching with deep satisfaction as the crew began unloading 8-foot wrought iron fence panels. What are you doing? Linda called out, her voice cracking. David turned to her with a pleasant smile. Building a fence. Permits were approved last week. Completely within code, completely on my property line. He gestured to the surveyor's stakes the crew was setting. 6-foot wrought iron fence with brick pillars at each corner. It'll run along the entire property line between our houses and across the front, enclosing my driveway completely. Should be done by Friday. Linda's face went from pale to red. You can't do this. It'll look horrible. The HOA... David pulled out another document. There is no HOA in this neighborhood, Linda. I checked. And the fence meets every municipal code for height, setback, and materials. I designed it myself and had it reviewed by the county planning department, where, as I mentioned, I've worked for 15 years. He paused, letting that sink in. You wanted parking space? You've got your entire driveway, but you'll never use mine again. The crew worked with impressive efficiency, clearly briefed on the timeline. By Wednesday evening, the brick pillars were in place. By Thursday afternoon, the fence panels were being installed. Linda tried complaining to other neighbors, but the story of her 6-week parking Violations had already spread. Mrs. Patterson, from across the street actually, brought the construction crew lemonade and told them to take their time and do it right. On Friday morning, as the crew installed the final panels and the automated driveway gate, Robert Westbrook arrived home early from his business trip. David watched from his kitchen window as Linda explained the situation on their front lawn, her gestures animated and desperate. Robert's body language said everything. He stepped back from her, shook his head repeatedly, and disappeared into their house. 20 minutes later, he knocked on David's door. "I'm Robert Westbrook," he said quietly, his face tight with embarrassment. "I just found out what my wife's been doing." I'm so sorry. This is completely unacceptable." David invited him in, showed him the documentation, the videos, the signed agreement. Robert sat at David's kitchen table with his head in his hands. "She told me you were being unreasonable about shared parking. She never said she was parking on your actual property. Jesus!" He looked up at David. "The $2,000, is that covering your actual costs?" David shook his head. "Not even close. But I'm not trying to bankrupt anyone. I just want to be left alone on my own property." Robert stood, shook David's hand formally, and delivered news that made the fence even sweeter. "Linda's partners at her real estate firm found out about this. One of your neighbors mentioned it to a client, and it got back to them. They're putting her on probationary status. Any more ethical complaints, and she loses her affiliation with the firm." He paused at the door. "My daughter is mortified. She has friends in this neighborhood. Linda's trying to blame you, but Jennifer knows better. We all know better now." That evening, as the construction crew packed up their equipment, David stood in his newly enclosed driveway and felt something he hadn't felt in 2 months. Peace. The fence was beautiful, professionally installed, aesthetically pleasing, and absolutely unmistakable in its message. His driveway was his driveway. His property was his property. And Linda Westbrook had learned a lesson that would cost her far more than $2,000. 2 months later, on a crisp December morning, David Chen sat in his garage with the door open, organizing his tools while his coffee steamed on the workbench. His driveway was immaculate, the new fence gleaming in the winter sunlight. Not once since October had any vehicle touched his property without permission. Linda Westbrook's Mercedes stayed carefully within her own property lines. In fact, Linda herself had become almost invisible, working from home more often, clearly avoiding any interaction. David had heard from Mrs. Patterson that Linda's real estate business had taken a hit. Word travels fast in professional circles, and apparently her partners had reduced her to mostly administrative work while she rebuilt her reputation. Her daughter Jennifer had apologized to David in person one Saturday afternoon, embarrassed and sincere in a way her mother had never been. Robert had nodded respectfully whenever they passed each other, the kind of distant civility that comes after conflict. David's elderly neighbor, Mr. Rodriguez, had stopped by the previous week with homemade tamales and told him something interesting. Apparently, Linda had been pulling the same parking stunt at her previous address, had received multiple complaints, and had moved specifically to avoid the consequences. "You did the neighborhood a favor," Mr. Rodriguez had said, patting David's shoulder. "Sometimes people need to learn the world has rules." David had installed a small plaque on one of the fence's brick pillars, visible from the street. It read simply, "Private Property, D. Chen, Esture 2020. Every morning when he left for work and every evening when he returned, David used the remote for his automated gate, watching it swing open and closed with smooth precision. The fence had cost him nearly $12,000, even with the contractor's discount. The $2,000 from Linda barely covered materials, but every single penny had been worth it. As David sat there that December morning, his project motorcycle finally under cover where it belonged, his work truck properly secured, his garage accessible on his own schedule, he reflected on something his mentor had told him years ago when he'd first started engineering. Good design isn't about making something complicated. It's about making something that solves the problem so completely that the problem never comes back. Linda Westbrook had thought she could bully her way into free parking because confrontation seemed like more effort than compliance. She'd assumed that a quiet, polite engineer would eventually give up and accept her entitlement. What she'd never considered was that the same mind that designed bridges, roads, and public infrastructure could apply those same skills to a personal problem. David Chen had learned that sometimes justice doesn't come from a courtroom or a police report. Sometimes it comes from understanding the rules better than everyone else and refusing to be pushed around on your own property. And as he finished his coffee and closed his garage door, preparing for another day of designing the infrastructure that held communities together, he smiled. Because justice, whether served by judges or by contractors with fence posts, was equally permanent when built on solid ground. Across the country in Scottsdale, Arizona, retired attorney Margaret Cho was tending her prize-winning rose garden when her HOA president demanded she remove her unapproved modifications, specifically the small bronze memorial bench dedicated to her late husband, a decorated federal judge. Margaret set down her pruning shears and studied the man with the same expression she'd once used to dismantle hostile witnesses. Unapproved? She repeated softly, pulling out her phone to show him the approval email from 3 years ago. Or did you simply not bother checking the records before making demands? The president stammered something about new standards. Margaret smiled, the same smile that had preceded 43 consecutive trial victories. I think we should discuss these new standards at the next HOA meeting. In fact, I've already sent meeting requests to every homeowner. I'm sure they'll be fascinated to learn what else you've been deciding without proper authority. The president went very pale, but that's a story for another time.